Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. This is the third episode in which global futurist and metaverse strategist Sylvia Gallusser and I have been exploring the future of content creation in news and media and beyond, and the evolution, perhaps revolution, of the identity economy. In the first episode, we explored the context of AI development, focusing on generative AI, then looked at the opportunities and risks associated with content creation through the lens of journalism. Then in the second episode, we dug deeper into the opportunities and challenges of using generative AI and looked further into the future, exploring 3 scenarios from 2050. Today, we are delighted to welcome strategic communicator and futurist Gina Clifford and technology innovator Rob Tyrie to the podcast to share new perspectives on the scenarios and explore what the identity economy could mean for our futures. So the 3 scenarios, Sylvia, when we described and talked about the scenarios last time, we focused on frugal AI, around constraint for the greater good, effective regulatory environment for these technologies. We looked at a tech supercharged world with lots of immersion, interactive assets, automated content creation, and then finally the reality continuum, growth transformation scenario, device and platform plurality, as I put it, and the normalisation of AI. Take us into just a little bit more detail to start this discussion, if you would. What were some of the other details within those 3 scenarios?
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. And really nice to have you here, Gina and Rob. So our first scenario, Frugal AI, is really one of, I would say, constraint for good. And I'm sure, Gina, you would like that type of scenario given the sustainability component and aspect. And I know how much you love to talk about mycelium, and I hope we will have a bit of that today. But really, in this scenario, there's an emphasis on ethics, responsibility, regulation, and sustainability. Gen AI content is not omnipresent. There are disclaimers enabling individuals to identify the difference between AI agents, AI-generated content, and human content. Moderation also is better as policies are favoring democracy, safety, privacy. And also we teach children how to not overuse technology, how to be aware, conscious about their use of AI for search, for conducting studies, and so on. Also, another example, companies have kind of usage quotas. Each search is attached to a carbon footprint, so we are aware of the associated cost for the environment. We rely on a series of devices that are eco-friendly, like the Eco Tablet, a low consumption device powered by solar energy. So really exploring new types of energy as well. The second scenario we mentioned last time, Steve, is indeed the tech supercharged world, which is maybe closer to a cyberpunk scenario, although not so extreme and dystopian. But definitely there are a lot of AI assets we live with in a sort of symbiosis, but there's definitely a lurking risk that we lose control. So we live in a world with 2 speed, like some people really adapt quickly. They like those immersive experiences, virtual worlds, interactive assets, overlays of information in a kind of sci-fi way. There are a lot of augmented media on top of the real world, multiple devices, miniaturization, sensors everywhere. But what happened is, because we live in that profusion of AI-generated assets, books, TV shows, phone operators, and so on, there's the reign of the identity economy. You can also sell your identity, your real identity, your private identity, your biometrics, but also your virtual identity. So we harness all different forms of identity. But as a consequence, also, there is some resistance. And that's why I'm talking about this 2-speed world, because we see the rise of new syndromes, mental health syndromes, people who feel overwhelmed. So that's why we're also on the brink of collapsing, as we feel this is not a stable state. And that's what leads us to the third scenario I'm really willing to explore with you all today, which I'm really interested into exploring. I call it the continuum, the reality continuum. We live our life throughout a continuum of identity and a continuum of realities. So it's more a growth transformation scenario if we talk about futurist concepts here. The tech world is not completely crushing us. It's more in the continuity of what we live today. It's the same way you can make the difference when you talk to your Alexa device or when you talk to your neighbors. Well, you're able to interact with AI agents by feeling what is true and what is a fake or simulated content. Sorry. So there is more integration in a smart way between these two aspects throughout our lives. Another example, we might use AI safe word when we talk over the phone or over different devices to our close one, ways so that AI is normalized. And once again, we make the difference between human and AI. Perhaps, once again, we sell and harness an avatar, but our private identity in that scenario remains protected, anonymous. Information comes in a variety of forms, from human-generated to automated, but here again, we learn how to distinguish. The same way we make the difference when we read a newspaper, a blog, social media, an expert analysis. We learn how to interact with different content and makes a difference. We are, in a way, educated from the early age on how to deal with such type of content. So this become a part of the education curriculum. So that's about kind of the three scenarios I have, but really excited to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Sylvia. Gina, Rob, what particularly strikes you about the scenarios? Is there one you feel is perhaps more realistic than the others? I mean, I guess one of them particularly sounds scary to me, and some of the other contributors that left messages for us as well think that they might be a little bit scary. What are your thoughts?
I'll go first, Rob, just really quickly. I think I love all of the scenarios, Sylvia. They're very, very thoughtful and thought-provoking, and I could see elements of all of them in the future. And I think over the next year, as we see more countries are going to be electing leaders than have ever been elected in the past, and with the rise of threat of totalitarianism becoming even more endemic, that could definitely sway the way the world goes toward these scenarios. And I kind of think if the United States focuses on maybe more toward totalitarianism in the next year, and then in the next 4 to 10 years, what impact that has on the rest of the world. And if we go back into AI, and the United States has more AI startup companies by far than any other country, more investment. So a totalitarian regime, a lot of power and influence over the world. What do they do with that technology? I think it goes toward the tech supercharged, but maybe in a little darker dystopian world. If things don't quite go that way, there's maybe more balance. And I like the constraint scenario. There's tons more that I could say, but I want to hear Rob's thoughts on it.
Thanks, Gina. It's good to be with you guys. Thanks, Steve, for putting this together and for your viewpoint and your long viewpoint, Sylvia. So I'll start with just a metaphor. I see across the three scenarios, based on observation, entanglement. They all exist at once. Depending on where you are, who you are, why you are, you may feel that it's a frugal world. You may feel there's balance in the universe, and you may feel that this is all over and Pandora's box is wide open. And there is no endpoint to this. We're up this curve and it's done. So in looking at this and exploring it, it's although they're happening at the same time, I think that if one defines some things, it helps to say where we're at in this sort of continuum. Because realistically, even with 100 million people a month using ChatGPT, we're at the beginning of everything here, and nothing is open and nothing is scary. Like nothing. The only thing that's scary to me is reading journalists who are uninformed and uneducated.
I think that's a really interesting point there about, this new tool, and perhaps we see this quite often on all sorts of different technologies. I was describing to someone the other day how actually about 5 miles from me, the first ever speeding ticket was issued to a car in the UK. It had left the man waving the red flag in front of it, left him behind because it was doing 8 miles an hour. And those things were put in place because we were scared of that technology. You picked up some really interesting points in the feedback that you sent us earlier on, talking about a number of different scenarios, and you spoke in that feedback about how many people from consulting and knowledge work are going to be impacted by this and related technologies. Talk a little bit about that, if you will, Rob.
Oh, certainly there's a good new study out of the UK, actually, one of the government organizations, and they've split out the 20 jobs that are most impacted by the advent of both large language models and splitting into general AI more aspects. And consulting is in one of them, knowledge work is in one of them. So I do think that people's role in consulting organizations, and we're all consultants on this call, our tasks are changed. I knew they were changed a year ago in my own practice. I got permission from my clients to use large language models and chat bots to augment my work right away. And because they were software companies, they accepted that agreement as long as I signed all the work. So as soon as I observed that myself, experiment on my own practice, I can just expand that to other people's practices. And I know full well in the Big Four, they're all cutting on the order of 10% of people a year, and that's forecasted out multiple years. And that's about realignment around that side. So jobs are going to change by tasks. Replacement of consultants? No, that won't happen. We just have different tools. I've been doing this for a bit.
Yeah.
The tools I had 35 years ago are not the tools I have now.
But we still have you. Gina, you spoke a bit about the issue of trust, and particularly in relation to how generative AI might be used in journalism and media. Say a little bit more about that, if you will.
Well, I saw a study recently. It was a journalism organization had undertaken, and they looked at people's trust with AI content versus human content. Wait, let me get this right. They trusted the AI content more than the human content. But because they used AI, they trusted the organization overall less. So they trusted the veracity of the content more, but the organization, they judged them negatively for using artificial intelligence, which is, it tells me that we're still trying to figure out where it fits. And people are funny. We're not totally logical beings. So you can't just say people are going to do this, because in 2023, vinyl outsells CDs. Not that either of them are huge in the market in the music industry, but still, there are more of us that would rather have vinyl than a CD. So we're not always going to do things the way logically we should. So as far as trust in AI goes, I think what's trending right now is the theme of transparency, labeling it if it's artificial intelligence derived or even augmented. Like Rob said, it's just journalists are using these tools to make their job easier, and they just need to say AI was used in the collection or the processing or something of this article. And I think that's a sweet spot where people will begin to trust or trust news organizations. And I have to say, the trust in news organizations before AI is pretty low. Honestly, people don't trust journalism. They don't trust journalists, which is sad. And I think it's a real threat to democracy. And it kind of goes back to what happens at elections in the coming year and where journalism sits. So, when Sylvia talks about in her scenario of automated journalism, there you go. If it's automated artificial intelligence, it's highly regulated on what can be journalism. then as far as trust goes, it doesn't even matter, because it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. It's like 1984, George Orwell's 1984. This is the storyline, and you have to agree with it. So yeah.
It's funny you say that, because I was just going to ask you, Sylvia, what's your perspective on trust across those three different scenarios? And what role does society have, do you think, with trust in mind, in driving either one or all of those three scenarios? What role of trust and society?
Wow, good question. Maybe first just a reply to Gina, another element we mentioned in our previous conversation. Steve, you might remember when we talk about the liar's dividend, which is kind of a new syndrome, that now we trust even less journalists and true content, because we know that content can be fake. So now that we live in an environment when we start to see deep fakes, even when we see real content, we don't trust it as much anymore. We start to doubt everything we see. And this can be used sometimes by bad actors who use it in a toxic way, let's say. The second thing I wanted to say also, because I've been studying this effect of AI on journalist organization and news organization over about a year now. It's very interesting also to see like the evolution and how quick it goes from being tools that they use with a lot of scare and they don't want to use it, and it's banned from enterprises and so on, to a state, and I was reading this latest survey, which I think was September. There was a new global survey demonstrating the way that AI has worked its way in the new business, even as journalists worry about its implications. So this study is by Journalism AI, might have seen it. It's an initiative from the London School of Economics and Political Science Journalism think tank. And it is it's also supported by the London School of Economics. And what it shows that 90% of newsrooms are now using some form of AI, either in news production, news distribution, or news gathering. It's like 90% in news production, 80% in news distribution, and 75% in news gathering. But at the same time, and that's the interesting point to balance it, there are still more than 60% of them that are concerned about the ethical implications of AI integration with editorial quality and other aspects of journalism, such as accuracy, fairness, and transparency that we mentioned also. So as Gina was showing, there's really like two levels. On one, there's more use case, more, it's there, it's around, but at the same time, there's also more interest, distrust. So that's why, if I relate now to the scenario, both are going to evolve. We're going to see more use case of AI use, like in society, in journalism in particular, but also in society at large, of course. But there's also going to be more concerns, more needs for ethics. So who is going to play that role is a really good question. And I would say probably in our first scenario, which is more government oriented and which is more constrained and disciplined, we might expect that from organizations, maybe from government as well, also from institutions which are cross governments, like more at the global level, so that there's not like one country that has like one policy and another country that has a different one. So it's more about collaboration and thinking about the consequence at large. In the second scenario, and that's why I really see a lot of tension in the second scenario, I feel once again we have different speed. There's a lack of regulation on one end because it's kind of out of control. We just see the benefits of using technology, and we underestimate the impact it can have on our mental health and so on. So that's why in that case, I would see like the people who are going to take that responsibility and rebuild that trust are probably going to be more like resisting group. So it's probably going to come more from minorities. In the third scenario, which I see more as a symbiote, I hope it's more like a collective responsibility that each of us also take. and that's why I mentioned schools and how important it is in the education curriculum that we start at an early age. And if I may bring a question also to the table, I would be interested also to brainstorm with you what would be like the life cycle of an individual in that new world, like from early age to retiring and harnessing our digital identity and so on. It's going to be all along our life, and we're going to have different institutions helping us along the way build that trust in our environment, in our news organizations.
Rob, what's your perspective on that? Because I know you've put together a few scenarios of your own, and you know, what's your sense of how this might evolve, what it might look like as we're trying to teach people from a much younger age how to use these tools rather than to do the jobs that the tools will do?
That's good. A good frame of calling it tools. And earlier, Sylvia, you mentioned transparency as being so important. Well, in media, especially journalism, it's fundamental to the idea of the professionality of journalism. So sometimes when I set up my frames to look forward, I always look backwards. I ask my questions like myself, like, what is journalism? Go back and look at Marshall McLuhan. Like, why is it a profession? Like, it's a profession, capital P. If anyone who has a public newspaper that declares themselves a body of journalism misrepresents the news, well, they're out of order. And there are actually laws and rules about this. You can't misrepresent. You must declare your errors. That's before any of this AI side of it. McLuhan dictated that any new media will change society. Anytime you consume something new, literally your brain changes. So our students of the future that are entering school now, in grade 1 or 2, they will be the ChatGPT generation, where their interface to the world will be with LLMs. And I guarantee you, they will think differently. They will produce things differently. And I also guarantee this, as humans, they will mostly act like humans. We're in this interstitial liminal part of the change where people are, you know, the cheaters and some of the bad actors are trying to get away with something that's nothing. So the cheaters are doing that. And then we've got constructs that are very conservative. You look at a 60-year-old teacher today, that person is very conservative. When they announced a year ago the death of the first-year essay, I'm saying to myself, are you kidding me? Are you really a prof? Do you understand the tools that you have? Do you understand you can't teach like you taught 100 years ago? The tools are different, and look what we can do with them now. With constraint, order, and if you want to live as a student now, if you want to be inspected, if you were worried about plagiarism before, and we were, people lying about what they produced out of academia, it's not going to be possible. The construct that's holding things up and that will hold things up is this sort of attachment to the past. We did this all the way, and this person who will graduate as a journalist in 2050, they'll just think it as, you know, plagiarizing is as using an LLM is just as bad as copying something from a library page and presenting it as your own. You're not allowed doing that. You're still not allowed doing that. And I look forward to the mass effect of someone cheating like this, because it'll just be like, beep, you submitted this article to the New York Times, Jane. It's rejected, and it's been recorded what you did. Your submissions are no longer needed. Being outside the frame in your third scenario, being outside the frame of the symbiotic universe where we're connected with tools and assistants that we create, that's a harsh penalty.
It's interesting, isn't it, how we seem to be coming up against a raft of technologies that make it so much harder for some of the more traditional societal and social approaches around education, around training, around identity, which we'll talk about later. And it's almost as if, you know, as a society, we're really struggling to work out how we make sense of them, how we regulate them, both at a social and at a kind of a legal level. And those kind of things seem increasingly to be behind the game. It was interesting what a couple of people that have said that submitted some comments on this similar theme, I guess. Peter Bittner says, I have my fingers crossed for the thoughtful policy approach of Frugal AI. And I fear tech supercharged path, which sounds quite dystopian, as you said, Sylvia, but plausible. And that's interesting in itself, isn't it? So much like you said, Rob, all parts of all three of these scenarios are likely to play out. But the plausibility of that dystopian one is what will scare a lot of people. Obviously, he's talking about that reality continuum as the one that resonates most with AI being normalized, but integrated in a balanced way, which kind of pays attention, I guess, ultimately to this kind of education and training piece. And Dylan Mers also says, I think we'll see messy implementation and the consequences of lazy or naive use of tools, which, speaks very much, I think, to what you were just talking about, Rob. Gina, what are your thoughts on this? What are the kind of differences or similarities that you see in terms of how we normalize these technologies?
Well, so the biggest thing that I think personally that impacts me, and so that shapes my perspective, is that the people driving and creating these technologies, leading the biggest tech companies, are all male. Many of them are white males. And it kind of concerns me that if you think about the homophily principle, when people hire like-minded people that look like, think like, act like those people, you got an army, a global army of people developing these tools for the male, default male perspective. And I'm not saying that it's evil or that there's some kind of bigger conspiracy here. I'm just saying that if it was the opposite and it was all female, it would be the same concern that these tools are being designed and developed by people who put a little bit of themselves into it. So the biases emerge, the data biases, and as technologies become more automated and more, they're ever present everywhere in every part of our lives. And you think about what happens in education. Who are we not including? Who are we designing for that wasn't in the room when it was designed? And how are those people going to be left behind or made to struggle or feel left out? Now, there is the possibility that we take control of that and we make more equity in the data decisions on how we train these models, that it actually accelerates learning. But I think there's a very big risk of, just like we've done in the past, like Rob said, you look to the past, you look at what's happened in the past. I mean, you can pick anything that you can think of that's been designed. It was designed for a male person, even down to healthcare, cars, streets, temperatures in buildings. So if we take that mindset and we continue now and into the future, now it's even more like a black box, right? We don't even know how it works, and it's working on us in a major way, every facet of our lives, especially if we think the tech supercharged area where sensors are everywhere. They're already everywhere. They're already creating and recording things and putting data together and making analyses of us to better target us as consumers. But what if we are now targeted as dissidents because we don't fit this model. We don't align with this data that's been created. And that's a pretty dystopian way to go, but I could see it's in the realm of possibility because of, like I said, the way the elections could go in the next year and affect the next decade of time. And, I want to be optimistic, but the reality is, if you look at things right now, there are mostly it's male-led at the top and making the decisions, making the investments, developing the technologies. So there's a cause for some pause, and maybe what can we do to make that more equitable?
Is one of the difficulties there that the driver is enterprise rather than government? Because at one level, I often think about, well, if we're looking at things that are kind of equivalent type of power, then I always think of nuclear power and artificial intelligence in its broadest sense. Nuclear power, generally speaking, is within the gift of governments. AI development certainly in the democratic world, is in the gift of enterprises. Is that the piece that actually creates a bit more risk of those dystopian futures? Gina, what you were saying was driving that thought, so I'll put that to you first.
I'm not sure I understand your question, but I can say that I just read that Microsoft is investing in nuclear power because they want to use it to power their AI engines. So, I mean, maybe there's, I don't even know if those boundaries really, if they really exist. Maybe they do in different parts of the world. So I'm not sure. I think that in the EU, governments are being a lot more taking a lot more oversight and a more of a cautionary approach, right? They're starting to put some guardrails in place, and I am not a proponent or one way or the other. I just think that I still don't think that that part of it is really what I describe as being the focus of those things.
Yeah.
I still think there's not enough, no matter if it's government or private industry, in either of those realms, as their real focus on equity and data, thinking about the biases. Maybe there are in some corners of research labs, but they don't see it as part of the policies that's being generated. And correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe Sylvia, you have more insight into some of these, or you, Steve, or even you, Rob.
Yeah, actually, that's something I've been following closely, and I thought I would bring also to the conversation here. You were asking in your previous question, Steve, like who is going to take care of this trust we can have and so on. And I forgot to mention like the AI Act, and it's really the news these days in Europe as at the time we're recording this. So just maybe to sum up what's in that AI Act, or what's going to be in that AI Act. So EU and the Parliament these days are agreeing on the content. It's going to pass probably early 2024 with an experimentation period of 2 years. But a few elements that I thought we could mention and discuss here. One of the first is that certain unacceptable risk that AI systems are bringing will be banned completely from the EU marketplace. About biometric identification that a lot of people are scared about, what's interesting here is that they will be permitted in public areas for law enforcement purposes, which has been like really a problematic topic in the negotiations, but they will be subject to certain safeguards. Another aspect, high-risk AI systems will be subject to revised fundamental rights, impact assessment, and transparency obligation. General purpose AI will be subject to specific transparency. There will be an EU AI office, a EU AI board that will be created with regulatory sandboxes, also to distinguish use cases, which is a very interesting aspect. And citizens will have a right to launch complaints about AI systems, which also is interesting to see how we can have a voice as citizen, and it's not just a top-down approach. So I invite you to read the detail of that. But why also I wanted to mention this.
Sylvia, it's 1,200 pages long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
by the way.
But use Anthropic, use Claude.
This is the fascinating thing to me. I'm Canadian, right? And we've got a bunch of Canadian politicians running around saying, we don't know how to regulate this. And meanwhile, if there is will and effort, governance occurs. And then let me just get a one-liner in here. There is no AI. There is zero AI in the world without government. Period. End of sentence. This has not been going on for a year.
Okay, so let me build on top of that.
Professional life since 1986, that AI was not part of it. Algorithms to execute mathematics and statistics to predict results. And then formal AI, actually, like formal cybernetics when I was in school. So this sort of like, wow, is that it's big. What I believe is unusual in the control of things, and it's just happened in the last 7 years, is $5 trillion market cap companies run mostly by white guys. Like that's governments. One of the barriers to the defense of the public between enterprise and in the middle ground between enterprise, government, and people, the defense was, it was expensive. It's expensive to go to war. was expensive to build a nuclear power plant. It was expensive to go to space. It wasn't the realm of enterprise. So that's like, oh, well, don't worry. We'll take care of you because no one else can build roads or build spacecraft. But now that part's new. And when I meet with politicians that are sort of my generation of 60, 65-year-old people, they're like in their 1950s economics class where there were no trillion-dollar companies. So they think they can make policies that'll work. Meanwhile, if we want to govern these things, we have to govern these massively scaled enterprises. And we did that at the end of World War II, right? We did that at the end of World War I. As a governments and publics, we in combines anti-monopolistic behavior, which is occurring now. So when we talk about bias, what worries me about it, it seems to put the argument on one individual CEO or 4 members of a committee that individually we've got to be diverse. Like, no, I disagree with that. Because you've got $1 trillion monster making rockets and nuclear power plants and the next LLMs. Now, fix that. That's what I want. Only the public can do that. Hopefully without revolution.
Sylvia, what are your thoughts on what Rob said? How does that play into what you were talking about with the EU regulation?
A lot of thoughts, but also I think it's interesting to understand the tension between government and enterprises. And I wanted to bring your attention and maybe share with your audience, Steve, a paper that was published in April that for me was kind of the paper of the year, and I really invite you to read it because it used future studies and foresight. It's called Future News Corp, or How the AI Act Changed the Future of News. So what they did is they bring a scenario. They constructed a legal fiction scenario to imagine like Future News Corp, fiction companies, and how the AI Act is going to impact that news organization. I think it's in the 2043. And what's really interesting is that it studies the shift of power, how the power is shifting from who is going to really decide what responsible use of AIs we should bring to world, from regulators and editors to technology developers and standardization bodies. So seeing this shift of power through the fiction method as Futurist is super interesting and really bring to see consequences that we wouldn't anticipate by just other methodology. So maybe we can bring that in the note if you're interested.
Gina, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think we're talking about AI. We all believe that it's going to grow into the future because there's so many use cases for it. Companies are already making millions of billions of dollars using tools like this. But, the geopolitics that's happening right now between the United States and China, for example, Taiwan Semiconductor basically makes all the advanced chips that go into these AI machines. And yes, there are lots of other companies trying to make them themselves, but nobody's going to make them at the scale that needed that TSMC can do. So, I mean, honestly, if Taiwan Semiconductor gets taken over by China, what chips are available to the world's largest AI investor in the United States? What happens to military operations? And then does the world get AI, or does just China keep most of that and the rest of the world has to struggle to catch up? Now, that's what I think is that, maybe these scenarios get tipped by geopolitics, and it comes down to the supply chain, and are these chips available to scale to the things that we want to build? And then it comes back to the cost of building and running them. They're expensive. Not everybody can afford to have their own chips making foundries, right? And even if they could afford it, they can't afford they wouldn't have the know-how to run them for decades, right? To actually build these chips. It's one of the most sophisticated manufacturing processes on the planet. And probably Taiwan Semiconductor is the only place on the earth that you're going to get these cutting edge chips. So So, I mean, if some people say China might invade Taiwan in between 2025 and 2027, if that happens, I mean, I think that takes a lot of this and shifts it, because now AI might not be the driving force that it was. And also, it's going to normalize. Right now, it's hyped. And so, yeah, it's going to continue. But at some point, if that were to happen, a war were to happen, what does that do for the focus of people's focus on technology? Now, maybe it's more security, and the government uses more of the resources for military, and we don't have access to AI for things like the media or education, because the focus is on military. And I don't know, I would like the conversation, maybe what you guys think in that scenario. If China was to invade Taiwan and take over Taiwan Semiconductor, how would that change the conversation around AI?
Gina, that's an absolutely fascinating question, and one that probably deserves its own podcast series. We've been talking for 40 minutes, and what I find really fascinating is we started with those three scenarios. We've got all these different perspectives, and what we've come to understand, I think, is all these different drivers that come into play when we start to think about how these technologies will impact life, society, and business, and the role of governments in that regulatory process, the role of ever bigger enterprise in kind of pushing the boundaries of these technologies. And then finally, the point that you were making there, Gina, about the role of geopolitics and how that potentially impacts not only how we, relatively speaking, think about the importance of these technologies given other security concerns. So, if you don't mind, I think we'll park that and for another day and another podcast. And let me thank you all very much for your time. But say we'll be back really soon, won't we, to talk about the identity economy. Rob, Gina, Sylvia, thank you so much for that. Absolutely fascinating. We'll be back in the next episode to talk about the identity economy. In the meantime, thank you everyone for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the Informing Choices mini pod, and we'll see you again soon.